This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and to help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. And if you want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode, join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. Oh, this may mean something.
I've been coerced into watching tonight's movie.
You do have books in the 24th century.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. We haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture and how Star Trek relates to it. I'm Duncan Barrett and today I'm joined by a very special guest. It's Star Trek novelist Greg Cox. Hi Greg, how are you?
Very good. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. It's great to have you on the podcast. And the reason we wanted to have you on, it was actually Tony's idea to get you on, was to talk about some books that you wrote quite a few years ago now, I realised. I mean, I sort of had these on my shelf, waiting to get around to them for a while. But these are the books about the Eugenics Wars, because we were kind of interested in looking at the way that Star Trek has approached this subject of genetic engineering, genetic modification, and particularly the kind of background of the Eugenics Wars. And Tony was saying, if we're going to do that, you've got to get Greg Cox on because he's the guy who literally wrote the book on that subject. I was wondering, first of all, you could talk to me a little bit about how those books came about, because I know you did another book as well later, which I haven't got to yet, about Khan, sort of Khan in exile, effectively. But these books, which kind of tackle this question of the Eugenics Wars, and really quite cleverly, I think, managed to sort of reconcile one of the problems that happens with Star Trek occasionally, where something that is sort of posited in the future suddenly catches up with the present. So you've got, in the 1960s, this fictitious war taking place 30 years hence. And then 30 years hence, not only are we not living through it in the real world, but on Star Trek Voyager, they've got an episode set in the 1990s, which very much seems to be in our world. And you sort of somehow managed to square that circle, I think, with these books.
Well, in fact, when we're talking about doing these books with my editor at the time, the Star Trek editor was John Ordover, we realized there were two different approaches you can take to doing the fearsome Eugenics Wars of the 1990s. As we were writing these books in the 1990s. One was simply to throw real history out the window, aside we're in some sort of alternate Star Trek universe, and do a amazing, kick-ass, apocalyptic Eugenics Wars thing that didn't actually happen. Or we could try to do something sneakier and more fun, we thought, which was to try to somehow reconcile the actual history we were living in of the 1990s with what had been established about the fearsome Eugenics Wars back in the day. So we kind of took it was like a giant crossword puzzle of trying to take real history, Star Trek history, and make them somehow, mate them together here,
And you do an amazing job of it. I mean, you managed to get so much into those books. I think, for me as someone who sort of grew up in the 90s, there's also an element of kind of, not quite nostalgia exactly, but there is this, and you go back earlier. I mean, the first of the book starts in the 70s, really, and it kind of, they managed to touch on a lot of real world history one way or another in a way that I think's quite clever. And you use the fact that you've got, the Gary Seven character and Roberta Lincoln as well, sort of picking up that strand as a way of sort of having these agents on Earth who are there, which is a brilliant move, I think. And also bringing in all these other characters. I feel like you must have got in pretty much every 20th century Star Trek character one way or another. You kind of work them into those books somehow. So it does feel like it must have been a real feat kind of plotting them out and working out, how do all the pieces fit together? How do you kind of, make this fit? Because it is much more complicated and much more sprawling than a typical Star Trek novel, I guess, that takes place within one adventure that might be, one episode or one movie or whatever. This is something where you are really telling a period of, I suppose the second book is focused more in that period in the 90s, but the first one is covering, the years leading up to that as well.
Oh, yeah. I've got them running, just people who have not read the book. Khan starts out as a small child, the product of a genetic engineering project in India. And as the years go on, we've got him at, running into Reagan and Gorbachev at a summit in Reykjavik. I've got the Bhopal disaster. I've got I had at the time an entire shelf of books on Indian history that I was consulting. I remember I went nuts one entire day trying to figure out what the Indira Gandhi International Airport was called before it was named after Indira Gandhi. I was looking at travel sites, and because obviously it wasn't called that before her. I was trying to get the real history as accurate as I can. And as you mentioned, being a hardcore Star Trek trivia enthusiast, I was trying to bring in as many, even if only as cameos, as many characters as a step that we've seen from the 20th century, like those cryogenically frozen people from the neutral zone on TNG. I think the book Chicago Mobs in the 1990s, Chicago Mobs in the 1920s, which was supposed to have been published in the 1990s, and of course later caused the whole Gangster Planet to happen, makes a cameo appearance. I think Roberta clobbers somebody over the head with it at some point. In a bookstore. There was, and actually, I got to give credit to, again, my editor, John Ordover. We were having too much fun. He was calling me up and he was suggesting, we got to work this in. And if you look close enough, there's all sorts of vague allusions to not just Star Trek, but other stuff from the 60s and 70s. Look carefully, the Bionic Woman is in there. Look carefully, there's a reference to the Wicker Man, to the Stepford Wives. We were just, Johnny Quest. We were trying to sort of, lots and lots of Easter eggs. And I remember John would call me up excitedly in the morning because he'd figured out how to work in a Johnny Quest Easter egg into the book. And we would go for it. Well,
the other element that really struck me along those lines actually is a more sort of general thing, not so much an Easter egg, but I guess because you've got Gary Seven, you've got this sort of association. I assume it must have been deliberate, the fact he was Gary Seven, and you have 007, and there's sort of James Bond element. And it really struck me in the novels that you construct Khan as a kind of Bond villain. And even in the first novel, even when Khan's a child, there's this sense of this kind of underground facility, and it all feels very much like it's come out of a kind of classic James Bond story. And I sort of thought that was interesting because I don't know why I'd never really sort of made that connection with the Khan character. I suppose there are different ways of seeing him. You can see him as a kind of Bond villain, and he is in that he's very charismatic and kind of, megalomaniacal and kind of slightly mad. He is the kind of larger than life sort of Bond villain type. But he's also like a kind of, I suppose he's a super villain because he's got his kind of super strength. And by the time certainly you get to something like Star Trek Into Darkness with Benedict Cumberbatch playing Khan, that film always feels to me very much like a superhero movie. But even in, in all the manifestations of the augment storylines, whether it's in, the original series or Enterprise or whatever, you do have this sense that these characters are not only, so much of it is about this kind of increased intellect, but also increased physical strength, increased, agility, quickness, and so on. There is that kind of sense of, it does feel like it's an area where Star Trek can kind of move from the science fiction realm into these sort of slightly other generic sandboxes to play in one way or another.
Well, you're absolutely on target there, especially with the Gary Seven and Roberta stuff. But yeah, exactly. Gary Seven comes out of not just James Bond, but that whole 1960s hip sci-fi, spy-fi era, the Avengers, The Man from U.N.C.L.E., Our Man Flint, etc. Gary Seven is very much, coming out. He's got his, handy gadgets, the sidekicks. And in fact, I confess, when I was writing the Gary Seven segments in those books, I was usually listening to, for inspiration, Bond soundtracks, the Our Man Flint soundtracks, the Avengers soundtracks. And by Avengers, I mean Steed and Emma, not Captain America, the Hulk. I think Gary Seven always, which again was a TV pilot from the 1960s, basically, was part of that whole super spies were hot. The Avengers, The Man from U.N.C.L.E., Bond, and all his Matt Helm and all his mini imitators. So yeah, I was deliberately going for kind of a James Bond vibe, the secret underground headquarters, etc. That's not coincidence, and that was absolutely deliberate.
And it's great, I suppose. I mean, another way of looking at this story, because it does take us through so much time with those characters. And I know you've written about those characters in other Star Trek tie-in books as well. But I suppose insofar as that episode was really a kind of backdoor pilot for a show that never came to be, because we got Star Trek back instead, which obviously we're all very thankful for. I sort of love that idea of sort of seeing where those characters were going, because so much of it is not... I mean, you've got this kind of framing narrative about Kirk and Spock and McCoy on the Enterprise, and this kind of contemporary, for them, storyline about a colony of people who are involved in genetic engineering and the kind of rights and wrongs of that. But other than that, it is really, it is a Gary Seven and Roberta Lincoln adventure in a sense, as much as, and obviously Khan is the kind of the thread running through that's going to kind of carry forward, I guess, going into the Wrath of Khan, obviously. But I mean, it's kind of, it is almost an episode or a series or a couple of series of that TV show that we never got to see.
In fact, I'll tell you a true story how those books happened, the Eugenics Wars. Those happened, honestly, by accident. Mm-hmm. As you mentioned, I had previously written a Return of Gary Seven novel. Mm. And at the end of that novel, I had just as an Easter egg, as a throwaway little line, mentioned, there was some where Spock mentions, well, Gary Seven and Roberta must return to their own time because my historical research indicates that they are instrumental in the downfall of Khan Noonien Singh. Mm-hmm. And I swear to God, when I wrote that little tag at the end of that book, I just thought it was a cute little punchline to the book,
An in-joke.
Yeah, it was an in-joke. And that made sense because they were contemporaries. Oh, that's a nice way. Well, we have to return them to their own time because they have to stop Khan. That's neat. But what happened then is that my editor, John Ordover, called me up and said, Greg, that's a great idea. Do you want to write those books? Mm-hmm. I swear to God, I was not deliberately setting that up for sequels. But John read that sentence, which was like a throwaway bit at the end of the Gary Seven book, and said, Gary Seven versus Khan. Well, Greg, you've got to write that book. And I'm like, oh, okay. And that started us on, 3 books later, I'd written 3 books about Khan.
Well, one of the things, I mean, I mentioned, as someone who certainly lived through some of those, I've certainly lived through the 1990s. I mean, my memories of that period are clearer than the sort of some of the earlier periods that you write about as well. One of the things that jumped out at me, was a very small thing, but it made a lot of sense, was the reference to GM tomatoes. And I remember the kind of complete panic that there was around this issue of genetic engineering. And it was all geared towards tomatoes. It was in the UK, it was all about a company called Monsanto. I don't know if it was the same in the States or if it was different companies doing the same kind of things or how all of that worked. But it really something about that, it really captured that moment in a way. And I thought that was brilliant to bring in something from our real world that is absolutely tied into this idea of genetic modification and that taps into our real world fears that we did have at that moment about this. Obviously, in your fictional version, that's the tiniest tip of the iceberg. And there's this, huge kind of secret project and these secret supermen and superwomen going on sort of pretty much undetected or not officially recognized by the media and by the sort of authorities and so on. But I just thought that was a kind of wonderful element of kind of linking the real world genetic sort of moral quandary to this fictional moral quandary, which is much more about, the slippery slope and look, this is the end point. I mean, that's what Star Trek seems to be saying is, you don't start dabbling with these things. And even by the time you get to Deep Space Nine and you have these kind of slightly grayer questions of, people who may be like Bashir, who did, arguably clearly he benefited very much from genetic modification. Other characters that he encounters along those storylines did not in various ways. But, the argument that Star Trek seems to present over and over and over again is kind of don't mess with this, don't mess with nature in a sense, because it will lead in a scary direction. And that was exactly the kind of debate that people were having around these tomatoes back in the 90s. Well,
there's a bit in the book involving a glow-in-the-dark rabbit who's been sort of injected with bioluminescent DNA kind of thing. That was real. I there was a glow-in-the-dark bunny, and that being experimented, I think I knocked it ahead a few decades,
Mm-hmm.
But the glow-in-the-dark bunny was an actual experiment that took place, and I didn't make that up. Although it's funny, that was one of the things I struggled with that book was how far believably could I have, because I was sort of locked into the idea that Khan had to be an adult in the 1990s, how far back can you realistically push the idea that they were doing human genetic engineering? I thought I pushed it back as far as I could, because really, Watson and Crick and a lot of this stuff wasn't even, how believable, even allowing for mad scientists, was it that there was genetic engineering creating children back in the 60s or the 70s? Although there's something we should acknowledge, which is the whole bit about Khan being genetically engineered, the whole bit about Khan's people being genetically engineered, is a retcon. That was not mentioned in Space Seed. The whole idea that these people were genetically engineered comes from the Wrath of Khan in the 80s. If you watch the original episode, they're just talking about eugenics, selective breeding. There's no talk about, you can rationalize that eugenics experiments involve genetic, but no one is talking about DNA or genetic engineering in the original Star Trek episode from the 60s. They're talking, they're thinking the Nazis. They're thinking eugenics experiments, selective breeding. It's not until we get to the 1980s that it's established the Eugenics Wars was about genetic engineering. The 1960 episode is using an older meaning of eugenics, older Nazi-ish meaning of eugenics, which is just, sort of selective breeding experiments to produce a
race of supermen and superwomen. That's absolutely.
But it's sort of funny to realize now that we now take it for granted because it was established in Wrath of Khan, and then subsequently in Deep Space Nine and every other reference to the Eugenics Wars, it was about genetic engineering. Space Seed is not about genetic engineering.
Yeah, which is a fascinating point, I think, because it's partly because it's science fiction and because we expect it to be a sort of Frankenstein-y story and kind of pushing the boundaries of science, and we do what we can rather than what we should, and we questioning these things. I mean, because these are such kind of classic science fiction tropes in some ways. But I think you're right, absolutely. I mean, when I went back, in preparation for this and watched Space Seed, that struck me as well. And the fact that, the original series has so much that is inspired by the experience of the Second World War. Because, many of the people who worked on the original series had been through the Second World War. It was quite recent history for that. It was, within living memory.
For a lot of those people.
Matheson was one of the writers fought at the Battle of the Bulge,
Right. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, and that definitely puts a particular spin on it as well, I think. The other thing that struck me, though, was one of the things that I think is fascinating about, the way that you kind of solve this in your book, but also just the general story, is it wasn't one nation that had done this. Do you know what I mean? It was, yes, in the post-Second World War era, we sort of think of, this was not Nazi Germany were doing all these things. We know Nazi Germany were awful because of all the other terrible things that happened during the Second World War. But in fact, actually, eugenics was a kind of international movement. In some ways, just looking into this, it seems from my understanding of it, that the Second World War almost, quite rightly, tarnished the reputation of genetics, of eugenics. But before that, eugenics was a kind of fairly widespread, popular form of ideas about these kind of quite science fiction-y in a way, like improving the humanity, and lots of people with supposedly lofty goals were seeing this as the new science that was going to help them kind of improve life for everyone, and this was the case all around the world. And one of the things I think is interesting about the storyline from Star Trek's point of view is that it is this kind of internationalist story. It's not just one country, and of course in your book you have to sort of rationalize, well, where did it all start? Yes, it all starts with this one secret project in India, although they are recruiting scientists from all over the world. But then the fact that these children then get sort of spread all over the place, so you've got a kind of a sort of anti-government nut job guy with a sort of cult in America. You've got these kind of different, you've got these leaders in the Balkans. You've got these different characters springing up all over, and obviously that is that comes from the descriptions that we see in the actual kind of on-screen canon. But it's an interesting way of looking at it, because it puts eugenics back as a sort of international project in some ways.
In some ways, it's odd. Wrath of Khan, which I love, and which is my favorite Star Trek movie, backed away from that. One of the inconsistencies is that in Space Seed, they make a point of, stating that Khan and his people represent a wide range of, races and ethnicities. He when he's calling out orders, it's Ling, McPherson, etc. But by the time we get to Wrath of Khan, for some reason they've all turned into, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Hitler Youth, which I had to do some fast dancing around in the third book. But it's sort of strange. You can see that Nazi influence to some degree. It's like Space Seed reflects the anxieties of the 60s, and the later stuff with the genetic engineering reflects the anxieties of later eras and GM tomatoes and all that. And yet the Nazi thing goes through. In fact, the Nazi thing resurfaces it even after they kind of veered away from it in Space Seed to make it an international movement. It kind of comes sliding back in Wrath of Khan because suddenly all of Khan's followers are blonde-haired, blue-eyed, Aryan types.
There's also that weird sort of thing about the kind of augment aesthetic. I find that kind of strange that in the Enterprise episodes that are about the augments, which I really enjoy, actually. I have quite a lot of time for those episodes. But there's this sort of weird sense that with them, with their kind of ripped outfits and everything, they seem to be sort of calling back to the sort of aesthetic of the Wrath of Khan somehow, much more than the aesthetic of Space Seed, if you know what I mean. There is that weird.
Suddenly they become barbarians and sort of
exactly, or like exactly, or like I always think that in Wrath of Khan they seem like a crew of pirates, but there is exactly that sense of they're not these kind of noble supermen in that sense, in the way that Khan and Ricardo Montalban, of course, gives him such sort of dignity and gravitas. And one of the interesting things about Space Seed is he does seem like a very, very charismatic. He's not a kind of moustache twirling villain at all. He is this very sort of persuasive character in some ways. He has a lot of good qualities as well as bad qualities, certainly in that first appearance.
And even we've got the whole sequence where Kirk and Scotty and such even admit to some sort of grudging admiration for him as an historical figure, much to Spock's dismay. I can't believe you were romanticizing this 20th century barbarian, And even the fact that the episode, Space Seed, gives Khan a happy ending in a sense. It ends with him, Marla beaming down, they're going to build an empire to reign in, the episode likes Khan enough that they give him a happy ending where he gets the girl. He isn't shipped off to a penal colony or blown up in some sort of James Bondian explosion. He gets a planet to rule. He gets the woman he loves. He has a happy ending.
And he is very, he's very cultured. He is quoting Milton, and it's interesting. There's that moment where Kirk gets the reference, and Scotty doesn't. Scotty says, "Oh, what was he talking about?" So it's a weird sort of sense of a kind of, which you could say comes back in the Wrath of Khan in a sense, but there's sort of almost equivalence between Kirk and Khan, that they are kind of well matched opposites somehow, and there's that kind of mutual respect maybe between them on some level. They seem to understand each other, whereas you're right, obviously Spock just doesn't get it at all. Totally doesn't get it.
He's this vicious dictator. Although, again, the episode because the episode kind of likes Khan. They do tell us, and this was something that of the various eugenics tyrants back in the day, of the various master race superhuman rulers that were fighting in the Eugenics Wars, that Khan was, on paper, was the best of the lot. He wasn't remembered as atrocious as the others. Spock takes pains to explain that he was in fact a dictator who ruled with an iron hand, but he wasn't apparently some sort of sadistic madman, unlike some of the other his counterparts. And it's interesting, as described, if we're talking about this, that the Eugenics Wars, as they are very briefly described in Space Seed, was not a battle between normal humanity and the evil superhumans. It was largely a battle between the various superhumans jockeying for power among themselves.
Which is quite an interesting element, and is one of the ways that I suppose, and I don't know why,
taking it, regular humanity against the evil mutants,
Absolutely, it is. And also I think it helps, in terms of the books that you were writing, it makes it easier to to comprehend that this is a conflict that's going on slightly beneath the surface, or that's being covered up to some extent, or that's sort of that generally people are not totally aware of. Whereas if it was kind of exactly humans against mutants or whatever, it would be harder to sort of keep the lid on that somehow.
Well, the conceit for the people listening who have not read those books is that what the future now knows of as the Eugenics Wars was not called that back then, and that the average person didn't see the big picture. You had all these atrocities and brushfire wars, and civil wars in Asia and elsewhere, and crazy survivalist militias in America. These were the Eugenics Wars. It was future historians who put the pieces all together and realized, but at the time this was kind of confidential. It was all hush hush. We basically applied the X-Files approach to Star Trek history, that this was all going on. There were people in the know, like Gary Seven, who saw the big picture. But to the average person, it was like there was a civil war here, there was a government coup here, there was a terrorist attack here, and those were the Eugenics Wars. But it was the average person did not know that the Eugenics Wars were going on. And you can even point to the Voyager episode. People always point to where were the Eugenics Wars, on that Voyager episode where they went back to the 20th century. I like to point out that they were only there for like 24 hours at the Voyager crew. That honestly, World War II was a vast global conflagration that consumed the entire world and everything. This doesn't mean that every corner of the Earth was a post-apocalyptic wasteland. If you beamed into Los Angeles in the middle of World War II, you are not seeing battlefields, wastelands, ruins, refugees. You're seeing, if you look close enough, there's probably posters up for war bonds, and there's a USO show going on. And if you picked up the newspaper, you would fear about fighting in the Pacific and fighting in Europe. But, nowhere does it say that, the entire planet was laid waste, that, San Francisco was a smoking ruin. There was, in World War I, in World War II, and I'm speaking as an American, you could go to Chicago. You're not going to find yourself in the middle of a massive world war. The world war is going on elsewhere. There's people are going to movies, or grocery stores, taking taxi rides. So I like to think that if the Voyager people had hung around longer in 1990, they would have picked up a newspaper and seen that, gosh, Khan Noonien Singh was reigning, off in Rajasthan somewhere. But when they were just running around madly trying to avoid changing the history, and they're running into evil Bill Gates, again, if you went back to watch old movies in the 1940s, not everyone is about the war. There are romantic comedies, there's domestic dramas, there's teenagers going to proms, there's Andy Hardy wondering what girl to take to the dance. I think, I don't think that Voyager episode I rationalize is inconsistent with the Eugenics Wars happening, and especially not with the sort of scattered, diffuse, sort of soft underground war going on in my novels.
Which is very much, A is kind of fitting with that sort of post-World War II, with the Cold War and with the conflicts that took place after that as well. It's kind of, that is more, when we talk about wars, that is sort of maybe more what we understand. But also I think it's interesting you mentioned the X-Files, because of course the X-Files, is very much of that era itself. It's a very 90s series. And again, a series that is very much concerned with digging up these kind of things from the past. And a lot of them ultimately do go back to the Second World War. And there is that sense of this kind of 1990s preoccupation with a particular aspect of the Second World War. And I think you see it in Voyager as well in the 90s, and in Deep Space Nine, maybe in different ways. But particularly, in Star Trek and in the X-Files, this kind of interest in these kind of dubious experiments, or in this kind of guilt associated with the war, and the kind of these sort of unacceptable things that were going on, not just the Holocaust, but also particularly kind of experiments or kind of pseudo-scientific abuses of various kinds, I suppose. And I think that is an interesting aspect. And, as you said, absolutely going back to Space Seeds, that must have been something that was very much in the minds of the writers in that period. I think would have been, because this was a big element of the Nuremberg trials, was some of the stuff connected to these sort of Nazi experiments and Nazi ideals, and that kind of eugenic ideal. And, there was a lot of, forced sterilization, these kind of things, because, I mean, there are different ways of performing eugenics, I suppose, in a sense, aren't there? You're either the way that maybe people breed dogs or whatever, you pick the best ones and try and put them together and you try and get the qualities that you're looking for. But the other aspect of eugenics is the kind of flip side of that, where you are basically trying to prevent certain people from breeding. And a lot, and in the wars, in the years even before World War II, all over the world, I mean, that was going on in America, that was going on, I think it was going on in Britain, many, many countries, there were policies of various kinds, that were connected really to trying to stop certain people from reproducing one way or another.
And indeed, the old-fashioned idea of eugenics, you can even see it in science fiction prior to Star Trek. Heinlein did a whole series of novels about a bunch of very long-lived people who had been bred specifically bred as part of a secret scientific project for longevity. Right. And that was not the sort of evil, we must stop the lesser people from breeding. That was just, these people has a lot of longevity in their family, let's breed them. And eventually, in Heinlein's future history, you end up with these very long-lived people just because they've been cross-breeding back and forth families with long lifespans, which get longer and longer. So that was built into science fiction before Star Trek, and that's probably the kind of eugenics. I do think Space Seed was coming very much out of the Nazis and the master race thing. Although it's interesting, the original script for Space Seed, Khan was not Indian. He was not a Sikh. He was, in fact, a Viking type called Leif Erikson or something. Originally, they were going to make him this Viking, Aryan, Germanic guy. I guess maybe they thought that was too on the nose. I don't know why at some point they decided to make him, East Asian instead. But, in the original draft, he was, I can't remember the exact name, but he was this Viking-esque blonde hair, blue eye guy.
Which ties into this sort of question around, how can you cast Benedict Cumberbatch as Khan and all these sort of issues. I remember people were saying then, well, Khan originally was, wasn't supposed to be a Sikh or whatever. But I mean, it's that absolutely. I think those kind of decisions change a lot of the way that the story plays out, because you're right. It's not, in that sense, it's not tying into that kind of, Aryan master race. It's not tying into that sort of
they veered away from that
thing. They did, absolutely, and I think that is one of the things that makes the story more interesting and richer in some ways. Is a decision like that, which kind of moves away. I mean, in some ways, as much as Star Trek is often very allegorical, that's there, I suppose, is an example of taking something slightly away from the kind of immediate sort of inspiration or whatever, and kind of trying to complicate it a little bit. And I think that absolutely sort of serves the story going forward. But it's interesting, you were talking about, the debt to kind of other science fiction. The other story that occurs to me is Brave New World, and this idea of this kind of, if you are thinking about kind of genetic modification and kind of, unnatural forms of kind of reproduction and so on. Although I was very interested in your book, and this had never really occurred to me, that, these are not kids that are they're not grown like Borg in a maturation chamber or something. They're requiring, willing female participants to bear to be pregnant, just as the Nazis did, required, women to bear these children in a sense. And that was one of the interesting aspects of it that really, I'd never really thought through before in terms of thinking about where do these kids come from. I had always sort of thought of them as a sort of a science experiment grown in a lab somehow, almost, without thinking that there was that sort of real biological component to it as well.
I can't remember entirely because, I wrote those books many, at this point, decades ago.
Sure.
I think that was partly a function of me just trying to keep it sort of grounded in reality, and how far back can I push all this future science into the 1960s and 70s. Maybe sure. I don't need to have scientists in the 1970s making kids in laboratories. Maybe it's an artificial insemination thing. Seem more realistically something they would be doing in the 1970s, science-wise,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it is interesting sort of looking at how these sort of ideas have played out in other science fiction stories, and the kind of concerns that go along with them. And I mean, I sort of feel like we keep coming back to the 90s, partly because obviously the 90s is when this supposed wars took place as far as Star Trek's concerned, but also because I suppose you see it playing out in storylines in the 1990s. I mean, I'm thinking of the film Gattaca, for example, which I don't remember when that was released, but that must have been kind of around that time. And obviously DS9 getting kind of interested in this subject again, kind of in the late 90s with Dr. Bashir and his sort of storylines. And it does sort of feel like there's that sense, as I said, about the GM tomatoes and so on. Then somehow it feels more, it feels kind of connected in a sort of different way. And then there's that other side of, I don't know if you've seen the TV series Orphan Black, but that show seemed to be very much, which was all about clones, and very much ended up being about this kind of, the Victorian era, the sort of birth of all these sort of things, and the birth of kind of eugenics and so on, and genetics and these sort of things, and going back almost to sort of Darwin and these kind of ideas. And the person who coined the term eugenics was in fact the cousin of Darwin. So there is absolutely, it sort of goes, this kind of this idea, this potentially very dangerous idea, really does go right the way back. It does sort of go back that far to these kind of Victorian ideas and this sort of Victorian mindset. And obviously the sort of Victorian mindset is quite different in many ways to the Nazi mindset. I mean, they have certain things in common, but there are almost different ways of sort of looking at it. And then Star Trek has its own sort of mindset and its own kind of ideals and so on. And there is this sort of interesting question of like, what are the, why does Star Trek, which is this kind of very technologically sophisticated, society that we're presented within the Federation, that there are sort of certain areas, and this is absolutely one of them, where there seems to be a real pushback against science and against the potential for scientific advances because of these kind of moral questions. There's a kind of real brake put on it.
I will admit that, when I'm writing a Star Trek novel, I feel obliged to pay some lip service to the Federation party line, which is that genetic engineering is, a bad thing and we should not do it. I'll be honest. In real life, I'm not sure I'm entirely there. I mean, obviously, if you could fix certain, genetic diseases, the strict Federation policy of we don't do this, I'm not sure does, like I said, run against a little bit of, the whole sort of yay science attitude of Star Trek, And I'm not sure necessarily that the idea presented even Spacey that, genetic engineering humans is going to lead to, evil, tyrannical superhumans, with megalomaniacal, and I think, particularly in the framing sequence of my books, where they actually do visit a colony of genetically engineered people who are wanting to join the Federation, I managed to slip some argument back and forth that maybe this isn't as black and white as the Federation likes to paint it. Sure. And indeed, you can argue that Deep Space Nine's whole agenda was also to look at the shady, or not shady, but the gray areas of Federation policy as well. You can make a case that maybe the Federation has overreacted, and they're traumatized by Khan and the Eugenics Wars and all that, but is genetic engineering, human genetic engineering, an absolute evil? I'm not sure I can go there myself. Lord knows there's a number of people born with genetic diseases and disorders and cystic fibrosis and muscular sclerosis. If we could fix that genetically, why not? And maybe they do. In fact, we do get the impression that, in fact, I'm not sure if it's ever been spelled out. If you watch Next Gen, they do seem to use magic DNA a lot to fix people. So apparently some level of genetic engineering is allowed. Apparently I'm thinking out loud as I'm talking here. I think the Federation policy seems to be that genetic engineering is okay for medicine. If you can go in and do a genetic fix to cure somebody of some terrible disease, you can do it. You can't change the baseline of human. Yeah. You can fix defective, I use the word not to sound ableist, but to use, you can use medicine to fix people who may have been exposed to radiation poisoning or whatever, or transporter accidents, or have some sort of, congenital condition. You can use genetics. where the Federation seems to draw a line is we're not going to make superior people because that way madness lies, and that's a slippery slope. We don't go down there. And you could make a case if you want to drop a deadline that genetic engineering to bring people up to maintain a certain baseline level of health. That's fine, to correct birth defects, whatever. Mm-hmm. But no, we're not going to make people small, faster. We're not going to create the X-Men.
We're not perfecting. That's the thing. We're not sort of trying to make a better human. And I actually think Voyager tackled this issue very well in the episode Lineage as well, where they absolutely draw that distinction between a procedure that is going to be sort of medically correcting something and decisions that are more about sort of cosmetic things or more about making decisions about, well, we'd rather, exactly like, B'Elanna is saying she'd rather the daughter look less Klingon, they'd rather, and she ends up with a different hair. Also, interestingly, it ends up making the child's hair go blonde as well. So it does sort of almost tie into that kind of blonde hair, blue eyed thing. But, very much that there's a boundary, and sometimes it can seem slightly grey because she and the Doctor end up sort of quibbling a little bit over, the Klingon third lung and so on. And she's saying, well, that's just like an appendix. It's a useless thing. Why don't you get rid of that at the same time? But this sort of question of, what is sort of medically necessary? And actually, thinking about that film Gattaca, that one of the things that's quite freaky about that movie, I think, is this sense that, people are making all these, everything is chosen, it's choosing this and choosing that. And the main character in that, the Ethan Hawke character, is this sort of real aberration of a child that was conceived naturally. And his parents just decided to sort of leave it to chance in a sense, which is...
Are you out of your mind?
All that any of us, I know exactly, all that any of us...
You're turning your children's biological destiny over to chance?
Yeah. But, the interesting thing is, with those DS9 episodes, I felt going back and watching Dr. Bashir, I presume now, compared to, watching it in first run. I have a 4-year-old now, and I felt for the first time watching it this week, I felt very sympathetic towards his parents in a way that I never had before. I'd always been very much on Bashir's side and felt like his parents were kind of misguided and awful. And it is sort of, it's interesting because he has this sort of sense, obviously he's been given this great intelligence, so on. He has been gifted a lot in a sense by the fact that this procedure went well for him, but he also has this sense of sort of kind of having lost something or feeling like his parents didn't want him or whatever. But at the same time, from the parents' point of view, there is that kind of terrible worry of, you spend so much time like comparing your child to what other kids are doing and kind of worrying about these things. And, are they doing enough of this sort of thing? And are they, is there writing behind, or is this thing behind, or are they, do you know what I mean? These are the kind of worries that parents have. And I'm not advocating genetic engineering, but, I felt like I could sort of slightly more understand where they're coming from. If they feel there's something that is holding their child back, and that there's something that they can do about it, then, I suspect a lot of parents would do slightly, questionable things in those circumstances. But then it's interesting, you have that sort of debate, and Worf is the one saying, but that's not fair. And, if one person does it, everyone's going to do it. And all this sort of thing about like drugs in sport and all these sort of ideas, that you sort of, that it's all, for him, it's almost about playing by the rules. And the rules are no one does this, because if one person starts doing it, then it kind of...
unfair to the people who didn't get the treatment.
Exactly. Yeah.
To make them super smart R&A students. Mm-hmm. But we're kind of dealing with that now with the whole college admissions scandal.
Right. Yeah.
Once again, but where the people involved are rationalizing this in terms of, I'm just trying to secure the best outcome for my child. Isn't that what a parent is supposed to do?
Yeah.
And it means giving my child an extra edge. Well, if it comes down to a matter of principle versus giving my child an advantage in life, I'm going to take the child advantage in life.
Yeah.
So far, no Hollywood stars are arranging to have their children genetically engineered that we know of, but
who knows? Maybe in a few years' time. But I suppose that the other thing is that Star Trek, you're right. Star Trek sort of has a certain line on this, and as much as it can kind of be questioned, because we do have, in Enterprise, we have those discussions where Phlox is sort of saying, well, the Denobulans have been doing genetic engineering for generations, and we just, we know where to stop. We sort of know where the line is. It didn't cause wars and chaos on our planet. But it sort of seems like, in terms of, in Star Trek more generally, it has to be seen somehow to go wrong. So even something like the Masterpiece Society in Next Gen, where they seem to have produced quite a kind of comfortable, functional, a fairly benign and pleasant society. They're not all going around, seeking power and killing each other or whatever. The society seems quite functional until people come from outside and start kind of disturbing it. But at the same time, there's this sense that there's something kind of weak about it because, for example, because they've eliminated disability, for example, they don't have anyone, developing something like Geordie's visor, and therefore, they're not able to, because the visor plays a key part in that storyline one way or another. So that they're almost holding themselves back. There's this sense that because they've made things too perfect and too cozy.
Well, they're not allowing any element of chance.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that gets back to Gattaca. Like I said, oh my God, why would you trust your child's DNA to rolling the genetic dice? The people in the Masterpiece Society don't do that, but as God, you don't get any freak prodigies. You don't,
Yeah.
They're not allowing any element of chance or surprise in their society, and therefore it's very stable, and therefore, they possibly lack any surprising breakthroughs or revolutions, because they are structured to maintain stability.
Whereas, interesting, I suppose, when you get to DS9, so we've got Dr. Bashir's storyline, but then we've also got those 2 episodes that feature those other genetically engineered characters who are notably less well adjusted than he is. But they're not and they, I think, refer to themselves as mutants at one point and freaks and so on. But they're very much not the kind of megalomaniacal Superman like Khan. They're more
inspired by Rain Man or something.
Exactly, yeah. And there's even this sort of sense of the kind of autistic savant element with them, being able to be incredibly able in some quite limited areas, but sort of socially unable to kind of interact with other people in a kind of normal way, and sort of brilliant but slightly morally. Do you know what I mean? There is that sort of sense, I suppose, where they're slightly cut off from what we might think of as sort of ordinary human
function.
They're a little off.
Or another.
They're a little off, yeah, one way or another. But that's kind of quite an interesting way of almost rewriting that story in a sense. And I feel like they do sort of keep emphasizing these are the ones where the engineering didn't take. It's like they got a, bad, like, backroom genetic engineer or whatever to work on them, and it kind of didn't quite work out, and they came out worse than they went in. But at the same time, it's a different way of looking at it. If the original series is saying you meddle with this, you get tyrants, you get kind of Hitler types, you get sort of ideologues, you get these sort of monsters in a sense. DS9 is sort of saying you meddle with this, you get
ambition.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Whereas DS9 seems to be sort of saying you meddle and you get people with sort of more relatable sort of personality issues, or kind of I don't know, you might say sort of autistic spectrum. These kind of, it feels like this is the model that they're kind of gesturing towards there somehow, is that it's to do with these kind of sort of conditions that we maybe relate to in the real world.
Well, here you can see, like I said, all Star Trek shows, although set in, an imaginary future of Star Trek, are products of their time. We discussed Space Seed. You can see World War II heavily woven into Space Seed. By the time you get to the 1990s, and the X-Files notwithstanding, there are different concerns and different worries and a different approach to these things. They're not worrying about creating an army of brand new Hitlers so much.
They're more. It's basically that it's the sort of anti-vax movement, effectively, isn't it? That Star Trek is almost putting there, saying don't meddle, because exactly, that's the fear that vaccines give people autism or whatever. That does seem to be almost what Star Trek is saying. Genetic engineering gives, has a kind of similar.
One does not want to think that Star Trek, bulls and anti-vaxxers, but
yeah.
But in fact, yes, that's sort of the same anxiety that, you must not meddle with, things man must leave alone, and sort of, mixing, tampering this stuff would be bad, and science is scary.
Well, and maybe part of it is that Star Trek has a very, it does have this very high-tech future. It does have this very sort of utopian ideal, but it is quite kind of on the technical side. It's on the slightly cool side, if you know what I mean. It's kind of machinery and so on. And it's not, I mean, compared to something like, say, Ian M. Banks's culture novels, which have in some ways a kind of similar sort of post-scarcity, quite utopian society. But there, everyone is modified and they're glanding different drugs and secretions. And it has a much more sort of biological side of it. I feel like Star Trek maybe has always slightly shied away from that kind of, I suppose it is the kind of
Star Trek
world
stays
side
away
of
from
sci-fi, you know.
transhumanism and all that. Up
Yeah,
until now,
yeah.
Up until, you know, there's more Star Trek to come. But yeah, to date, Star Trek has stayed away from the whole transhumanist thing, you know.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and he's quite suspicious of, you know, even things like life prolongation, or do you know what I mean? Anyone who's sort of trying to get a bit more out of their I suppose because Star Trek is always very invested in the idea of human beings as, you know, as what they are, as quite sort of earthy, as quite kind of imperfect. I mean, as much as we might say sort of Next Gen, for example, we see these sort of perfected, sort of idealized human beings in a sense, in moral terms. Star Trek always wants to get back to, you know, these sort of flawed, squidgy humans on some level.
Well, if you go back to TOS, indeed, you know, TOS is, you know, people like to throw out the word, you know, utopian in Star Trek. And I have a whole rant about how TOS is not utopia. You know, it's things are better, but you mentioned people are squishy and life is messy and people are imperfect. And the original series, for all, had very actually mixed feelings about technology. For every yay, Scotty has managed to find a technical fix to save our days. How many episodes are there where evil computers have taken over mankind, where evil androids are replacing us, where something, you know, where evil sport, you know, Star Trek had a deep sort of worry about the machine, about computers and dehumanization. This is a theme that pops up over and over again. You've got the you know, what's his name, Cogley, the lawyer who hangs on to his old analog books because he doesn't trust computers and eventually proves the computer framed Kirk, you know.
Yeah.
And generally, as a rule, if Kirk and his crew come to a planet that seems too stable, too peaceful, too utopian, there's a fly in the ointment. There's evil spores, you know, tranquilizing people. There's an insane computer god, you know, and usually there's a happy ending where, oh, good, look, people are getting drunk and losing their tempers, and you know, this side of paradise where they're all sort of relieved to find out that people aren't all or losing their tempers and acting like, you know, fallible humans again. And that's what Kirk doesn't like it when he runs into some planet where everybody's perfect and placid and some computer, you know, Landru, Vol, you know, a number of computers that, you know, everything is tranquil and peaceful. We do not know about sex or violence. No, Kirk's like, bring back the sex and violence. Okay. You know, he's got all these speeches like in the Apple and things about how we're not meant to be perfect. And, you know, we got to be human and, you know, and thank God I saw two guys get into a fist fight today and thank God they're normal again, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
So again, that ties in with the idea that, you know, that hanging on to humanity, not being turned into a cyborg. I mean, and the Borg is, again, all about taking your humanity away from you and quote, making you perfect. Yeah. They're more technological, they're not technogenic engineering, but it's the same idea that staying a weak, imperfect, irrelevant human and, you know, whom, you know, 709 looks down her nose at, you know, is a good thing. And to get too technologically advanced, be it by, you know, selective breeding, by genetic engineering, or having the Borg come in and assimilate you, is a bad thing. You want to say, you know, you don't perfecting humans never goes well, because the Borg are all about perfection. They'll tell you over and over again, you're blue in your face, and they're improving you, they're perfecting you, and they're sort of the logical extension of let's, you know, improve on humanity. We are going to, you know, completely take away your humanity and make you this perfect Borg creature, you know. And we're like, no. This is a horror story. In the universe of Star Trek, losing your humanity is a horror. Absolutely.
And I mean, the Borg are also, you know, they really are eugenicists, because they're basically racists aside from anything else, in that they will say, you know, some species, they'll say, we're not going to bother assimilating them. They don't have anything that we need. Do you know what I mean? There is a real sense of, you know, not only are they the best, but of the people who aren't as good as them, some of them are kind of on a closer level. And that very much does tie into, I suppose, you know, you could say going back to the Nazis. I mean, the Nazis treated different, they treated the British different than they treated the Russians, because they thought the British were kind of above the Russians and you're sort of up on more on the level with them. I mean, these kind of ideas of, I suppose it is that sort of pseudoscience of kind of, and it is the kind of, and again with the Borg, there is that element of the biological, which is part of what's sort of horrifying about them. Yes, they're very automated and they're kind of mechanical, but they're also, it's the cyborg element of it that is kind of freaky about it somehow. They're not just an army, they're not Cybermen. Do you know what I mean? They're not, well, actually, Cybermen maybe is a bad example because there are people in there, but they're not even on the surface a kind of army of robots in a sense. They're more threatening in a way than Law is,
Their whole fear is grabbing you and assimilating you, taking your brain and putting it into a robot body, which is creepy, is not, it's arguably less scary than being turned into this weird sort of half human, half machine thing, Exactly.
That's kind of, and they do grow babies in maturation chambers and things. I mean, there is something kind of slightly freaky and kind of Brave New Worldy about that in a way. But I suppose it's interesting, thinking about Star Trek taking this position. I mean, on one level, I think you're right. There is a kind of almost a sort of Luddite quality, particularly with someone like Kirk. I mean, maybe less so later on, but Star Trek does sort of have that built into it. And it is strange in some ways for a science fiction franchise, to have that kind of baked into its DNA, I was going to say, but literally that is part of its sort of its personality somehow.
Science fiction has always had two strains. Science fiction has not always been rah rah rah. The cautionary fable, we've mentioned Brave New World, 1984.
Frankenstein.
The Frankenstein. Yes, it's right. The cautionary fable of, oh my God, where is this science leading to us? The Andromeda Strain.
Yeah.
There's been this constant sort of dynamic push-pull between, science fiction, science is so cool, look at us, we're going to Mars. Oh, God, the computers have taken over, the robots have taken over, the Terminators are coming to kill us.
Sure.
Indeed,
yeah.
Star Trek, one of the things that's unique about Star Trek, the original series, and I always go back to TOS because, well, I'm old, is that in its own way, it actually was, it was more positive and pro-science than most science fiction up to then. Most of it was, you look at, stuff like The Invaders, they were horror stories. The aliens are coming to take us over, or we're going out into space and we're meeting terrible aliens and bringing them back. And, War of the Worlds and, Time Machine, you go into the future and you meet the Morlocks. And, indeed, most subsequent science, the Terminator is profoundly, oh my God, we're going to destroy ourselves. Planet of the Apes, we're going to destroy ourselves. Look, dystopias run through science fiction. And indeed, in pop culture, TV, I'd have to sit down and do the math. I would argue that probably the majority of science fiction TV shows have some sort of dystopian premise. There's been we're in a post-apocalyptic world. The gorillas have taken over. The cyborgs have taken over. The robots have taken over. The Martians have taken over. The lizard people have come and taken over. Star Trek is a positive, But even Star Trek,
it's interesting.
It has its occasional moments of, we're not sure we want to give this much power to the computers. We're not sure this scientific discovery, which could transform humanity, is a good thing.
And maybe it manages to maintain that kind of utopian, like Star Trek hasn't turned to a dystopia, so far, if you know what I mean, partly maybe by having those reservations. But one of the things that strikes me, thinking about this subject of genetic engineering and genetic modification and so on, looking forward, I mean, I think probably, even in the decades since the 90s, probably people have become more familiar with some of these things and maybe more comfortable with them. Is there a sense that, as time moves forward and maybe these things do start to become more a part of our lives, and this does seem to be something that maybe we start tinkering with more, is Star Trek going to look increasingly, is that sort of official Star Trek position going to look increasingly sort of kind of reactionary and alarmist in a sense? And are we going to think, no, the Denobulans are the ones who got it right?
I think so. You mentioned Frankenstein, and you look at a lot of the stuff, you watch old Frankenstein movies, not just the Mary Shelley novel. A lot, those shows get a lot of mileage out of the horror of the idea of, oh my God, pieces being transplanted from person to person, and digging up bodies and cutting them up and putting people's brains in wrong bodies. And nowadays we all have organ donor things on our driver's licenses.
Yeah.
I think one of the reasons why people have no one's really been able to get Frankenstein going as popular as, Dracula these days. To a certain degree, we live in a world where, kidney transplants are routine, liver transplants are routine, taking out dead people's eyes and putting dead people's eyes in your head. In the old days, this was the stuff of horror. There was the old story, The Hands of Orlok, which was an old horror movie staple, where about the guy who gets the hands of a strangler. Nowadays, we don't blink at this. Which is why it's kind of a struggle to make some of the old stuff in Frankenstein scary to modern audiences, because, oh my God, he's cutting up dead bodies and stitching them together. Well, yeah, I just got a kidney transplant from, the organ bank the other day. This is part of our lives. It could well be that as genetic engineering or even cybernetics become more routine, so there's that character on Star Trek and he's got a prosthetic robot arm. Well, why not, Yeah. And in fact, you see this on Discovery. I unfortunately can't remember the name of the character, but they've got a character on the bridge of Discovery who is, her backstory is she was in some horrific accident and now she's 50% robot.
Aaron.
And this is not treated as, so this was clearly something that, she did not plan. It was a result of a tragedy, but she's not portrayed as a monster on the show. She was a crew member on the show. Yeah, although inevitably they did the episode, spoiler alert, where somebody hacked into her and turned her against him. Just as come to think of it, people have been known to hack into Geordi's artificial eyes on occasion, advisors on occasion,
or hack into data as well. There is that sort of.
Yeah. But I do think that even watching Discovery, you see they're more comfortable having cyborgs on the show, because why wouldn't? In fact, it's kind of weird watching TOS occasionally. You see people with these horrible injuries, and it's like, we could fix that today. Why is the guy from Conscience of the King wandering around with a face mask over his face? Surely 23rd century science would be able to fix his burned face. But so I think it makes sense. Of course, the people would have. Again, Picard had an artificial heart.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he did. It's true.
And now visually, like I said, you can sort of see more sort of robot-y android characters, creeping into Discovery and its various spin-offs, which indicates maybe that the idea of tinkering with humanity to the degree of giving somebody artificial eyes is no longer the stuff of a Boris Karloff movie. It's it's the cutting edge of modern science. A few years from now, everyone will have we're starting to talk about growing livers and kidneys and using 3D printers to print people, lenses and, and heart valves and things. So I think, again, as real science catches up, suddenly, that was a scary prospect, but now my uncle has a mechanical, has pig valves in his chest, and so-and-so just got a 3D printed new leg. You may see more cyborg characters in Star Trek, and they would not be treated as, with the horror of, you see in the old episode about What Are Little Girls Made Of, where the guy being part robot is now a shocker horror finale,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I guess this is one of the dangers in some ways of having a 50-plus year franchise, is that, you are, which is kind of where we started off in this discussion, that, the fact of them predicting something being in the 1990s when that seemed safely in the future. And you get it again, of course, because DS9 was predicting things happening in, sort of around this. I think the Sanctuary districts were kind of pretty much, we're sort of up on that time period.
The Sanctuary districts are coming up any day now, and that's kind of terrifying. How close
yeah. I mean, you could well believe it, frankly. I mean, yeah, they maybe just bang on the money with that one. I don't know. But I mean, but generally that is the danger with kind of positing things in the future is if you're, if you have that longevity, then, you could say the same thing about 1984. I mean, obviously that was published in 1948 when 1984 seems a long way in the future. Now for us, 1984 is, well in the past as a real date, but obviously in the terms of that novel, we imagine that it is this kind of other reality that's created in fiction somehow.
But whether we played games to get the Eugenics Wars to work in the books, but eventually you as real history creeps up, overlaps Star Trek history. I mean, in theory, we should have launched that damn Saturn probe by now. Captain Sean Christopher or whatever in his Saturn probe, that should be, we've left that kind of in the dust already.
And it won't be long before the Vulcans are due. And, when they don't turn up, think of the disappointment. I mean,
Presumably they show up after we've had a catastrophic apocalyptic world war.
Well, that's true. Yeah.
So there is an argument.
The whole civilization wiped out before the Vulcans show up. I would just as soon do that,
Yeah. Fair enough. Maybe, who knows? Maybe we are living in the best of all possible universes, after all. Who knows?
Well, even
these compared to Star Trek.
We've skipped the Eugenics Wars, but again, we skipped the Eugenics Wars. On the other hand, apparently we don't have sleeper ships. Oh, those are the old-time sleeper ships they used back in the 90s. What?
Yeah.
I rationalized that by making the Botany Bay a top-secret project being, engineered at Area 51 from Quark's old spaceship. Mm-hmm. But the implication in Spacey was, that's when the old 1990s models, interstellar sleeps, sleeper ships, which we didn't really have in 1990.
And it will only get worse the more time goes by. But this is something. This is an element of Star Trek's longevity, I suppose, is that it has to kind of
could
engage
be worse,
with these
could
issues.
Be Space 1999.
Yeah, that's true. Good point. And obviously, we'll have to wait and see how, this issue of genetic modification, genetic engineering. I mean, it is something that, it came up in as you're right, say it was specifically eugenics and not genetic engineering in that sense in the 60s. It came back again in the 80s. It came back, with DS9 again in the 90s. It came back with Enterprise. It does feel like it's a topic that Star Trek keeps returning to.
It came up again with Star Trek, Into Darkness.
Yeah, of course, absolutely, with Into Darkness, yeah. So it'll be interesting to see how the kind of new kind of roster of Star Trek that we're getting now in this kind of new moment, this kind of revival in a sense of Star Trek in production, whether that is a theme that gets touched on again, and does it have a slightly different inflection in the same way as you say that the cyborg elements in Discovery seem to be handled differently? Are we going to see a sort of different angle on this whole element of genetic manipulation? Are we even going to see? I mean, there was talk, wasn't there, of Nicholas Meyer doing a mini-series. I don't know how much of this was just speculation or how much was genuine, but he definitely seemed to be working on something that had some link to Picard.
I think it was in development. I'm not sure how. Many projects, alas, are often in development. I think some effort went to it, but it never got greenlit that I know.
Right. But I mean, that would have been quite interesting to see in some ways. How does 2019 kind of approach those sort of themes and those kind of issues differently to, how 1980, when was the Wrath of Khan, 82, sort of early 80s anyway. How that period of time, how does that affect the way that we kind of see that storyline in some ways?
As far as I know, I could be blanking. I'm so far, like I said, the new stuff, Discovery, and down the road Picard, and haven't really done much with the Eugenics Wars or Khan or genetic engineering yet, unless I'm blanking on something.
Nothing jumps out to me, but obviously it is a big part of kind of Star Trek, canon and history that is a rich area to kind of go into one way or another.
I can't imagine they'll leave that for too long. One episode we haven't mentioned is Conscience of the King, which also ties into this. It's not really spelled out. But again, Conscious Key is another episode that comes very clearly out of World War II because, what's his name?
Kodos.
Thank you. I remember Anton Karidian, but I can remember his But, Kodos, seemed to have been operating on some sort of weird eugenics program as well. And it's not spelled out too much. His agenda he took advantage of the famine and the disaster on that planet to implement his, pet eugenic theories. We will give food to the people who are both worthwhile and productive, and therefore improve the colony to some degree. Yeah, that's sort of the whole sort of. Once again, you can see this is very much, that episode is about tracking down Nazi war criminals, which was a thing back then. Anton Karidian is living in Argentina. But even when we hear a little bit, and it's not really spelled out what happened on his planet too much, we hear snippets of speeches. There's talk about them deciding on some sort of basis of eugenics or superiority as to who was going to get the food and who was going to be exterminated. So even though there wasn't any genetic engineering or forced breeding in here, you see Kodos comes out of this whole sort of, well, we're going to improve the colony by winnowing out the weak and inferior and giving all our resources to,
Yeah.
So that was also clearly in the mindset, and you can make a link, even though there was no direct connection to the Eugenics Wars. Kodos had his own weird sort of, I'm going to, eugenics program going on during the famous, massacre,
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a eugenic storyline in that sense. And Kirk, of course, was there, so interesting.
And interestingly, what reminded me of this is one of the Discovery novels has actually addressed that. One of the Discovery novels is all about what went down on, with Kodos on his planet. So, again, so I'm thinking, Discovery hasn't touched this too much. Well, you did have the crazy eugenicist, you have Kodos, and you have the thing on, I'm blanking on the name of that planet, where there was the famine and he killed off 50% of the population. Discovery, at least in the literary version, has actually dealt with that.
Has touched on that. That is a good point. Well, we'll have to wait and see what, who knows what the next time this topic comes up on screen. It'll be really interesting to see how it plays out. But before we go, Greg, tell our listeners a little bit about what you've been working on recently, because I think you've had some Star Trek books coming out in the fairly recent past, haven't you? And are you working on any more in the future?
I have nothing definitely I can announce at the moment. I would be absolutely stunned if I don't write more Star Trek in the future.
Sure.
But in fact, my most recent book is called The Antares Maelstrom. Hey, that's another Khan reference.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that actually came out in trade paperback just a few months ago. It is surely in your local bookstore as we speak. That's not terribly eugenics oriented, but yeah, at this point I've written 16 Star Trek novels. Wow. I expect I will write more, because I've been writing Star Trek novels for a quarter of a century now. I did the math today.
Yeah.
And the most recent one is The Antares Maelstrom. That is a classic 5-year mission novel set during the time of the original series. And it has Kirk and his crew dealing with what is basically an interstellar old-fashioned gold rush situation.
Right.
Where, again, I was looking at real history, the Alaskan gold rush, the California gold rush, where a rare mineral, pergium, which you may remember from The Devil in the Dark, is found on some remote planet, and it sets out a huge, chaotic gold rush with aliens from all over the quadrant rushing to get and, stake their claim, then get rich, and chaos erupts, and basically the Enterprise is sent in to try to somehow impose order on this incredibly chaotic situation.
Sounds like a good one. Definitely one to check out. Well, thank you, Greg, for joining me. It's been a pleasure having you on the show, and great to talk to you about this interesting topic. But talking about eugenics and Khan and the race of supermen and the Eugenics Wars is not the only thing we've been doing on Trek FM this week. So here's a listen to what else you might have missed out on the network.
Previously on Trek.fm. To the journey!
Although I love the season finale of season 1 in Voyager.
What, Learning Curve?
Learning Curve?
Learning Curve. I love that episode personally.
That's not a season finale.
I love the episode. No, it's a standalone episode, but I love it. I'd want to keep that as a standalone episode. Once the crew's all aboard.
No. There's no.
Why?
You're insane.
I love that episode. What are you talking about?
You can choose 2 things from that episode that you can keep. Go for it.
Earl Grey.
The powers at Paramount at the time, they wanted it to be left more ambiguous, so the audience were.
But it's not all that ambiguous, I think.
Right. Well, you were questioning it
because there would have to, but there would have to be like there would have to coincidentally be something that happened to cause it to discharge and transport without Data doing that. And that seems unlikely.
The Edge, a Star Trek Discovery podcast.
You should buy yourself another one and do that. Like the little circle that goes around the top of the saucer section.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
That'll look
and
nice.
maybe a little bit on the nacelles as well. Just accents.
Or you could just get like a sticker of Jeffrey Combs as Shran and then stick it on the underside of it, maybe.
Oh, just a big Shran face on the underside of the ship. I like that.
Or kind of stylized, like how the Second World War bombers would have the pet pin-up girl painted on the side.
Shran the pin-up girl.
The Line, a Star Trek Picard podcast.
I got to say about your thing about Vasquez rocks. I mean, I'm disappointed that it's actually supposed to be Vasquez rocks.
Oh.
Yeah, because that means that we're not going to see Lazarus.
Okay. Yeah. I know you love the alternative factor, but
love the alternative
probably not a connection with Picard.
They all can still exist.
I was holding out hope, I was holding out hope. So, you never know.
There's lots of rocks. He could be on the other side.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
Check out all these shows and join the conversation about your favourite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they're published. And please leave us a star rating and a written review. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to do that. The best place to join in the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Choose to send to a show and select Primitive Culture, and that will come right to us. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. If you'd like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, so we really appreciate any support you can give us, and we hope you'll join the team. Again, you can find all our details at patreon.com/TrekFM. We'd like to take a moment now to thank our associate producers on Primitive Culture, Amy Nelson, Clara Cook, and Tony Black. Amy is a presenter of many other shows on the network, and you can find her on Twitter at Miss Amy Nelson. Clara and Tony were two of the former co-hosts of this show, and they'll be popping back from time to time. You can find Clara on Twitter at ClaraJeanMC and Tony at AJ Black Writer.
You're blended all right.